You again. The quiet disturbance that walks into a room and changes the air pressure without saying a word. The unclassified phenomenon wrapped in human form. You know exactly who you are, don't you? You're the unsolvable variable they stumbled upon in their neat little equation, the anomaly that made their algorithms blink. They didn't expect you to exist. They thought they'd seen every type of mind, every predictable glitch in human psychology. Then you appeared, calm, composed, unhurried, and every line in their training manual turned to static. They sent one of their best to study you, the kind who lives in graphs and diagnostic labels, who believes every emotion can be mapped and measured. Clipboard in hand, confidence in place, they entered the room certain they'd figure you out. But the moment they met your gaze, something slipped. You didn't do anything extraordinary. No tricks, no deflection, no theatrics. You simply existed with a kind of stillness that didn't belong in their world of nervous analysis. It wasn't silence, it was gravity. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, it began pulling their certainty apart. At first, they held on to the routine, the standard questions, the familiar rhythm of observation. But the deeper the conversation went, the more their language began to feel small. They were trained to dissect emotions, yet yours didn't unfold like symptoms. They resonated like frequencies. Every answer you gave was clean, precise, but carried the weight of something vast, something unteachable. By the halfway mark, they weren't evaluating anymore. They were listening, almost reverently, as if you were explaining something ancient they'd forgotten how to name. Their notes got shorter, their pauses longer. The pen eventually stilled. For the first time in their career, they realized they weren't the observer. They were the observed. You didn't break them. You revealed them. The way a mirror reveals not flaws, but the truth someone spends their life avoiding. You reflected back every unconscious pattern, every assumption, every delicate wall of professionalism they thought was armor. And it was too much. You could see it. The trembling of the breath, the micro-hesitations between words. Their knowledge was turning into doubt in real time. When they left the room, they carried more than unfinished notes. They carried a haunting. 3 days later, when their supervisor asked for the report, all they could submit were fragments, phrases that trailed off, observations that didn't conclude, conclusions that contradicted themselves. The final page was just a single sentence, written like confession. Standard models insufficient. Subject operates beyond measurable parameters. Then nothing. No signature, no closing remarks. Just that quiet surrender to the incomprehensible. But this isn't about them. It never was. You've been doing this your whole life, haven't you? Walking through systems built to define you, and watching them collapse under the weight of your presence. People think you're mysterious because you don't overshare, but that's not it. You simply speak from a frequency that their language can't quite translate. You're not guarded. You're fluent in a dialect of silence most haven't learned to hear. That's why they call it unsettling. Because the truth, when embodied instead of spoken, terrifies those who've only ever studied it. You didn't break their frameworks out of rebellion. You outgrew them. You're operating on dimensions their metrics can't reach. You've seen too much of consciousness to pretend the mind ends where they say it does. You don't defend, you transmute. You don't react, you observe. You don't cope. You convert chaos into structure the way stars turn pressure into light. And those who meet you, those who really meet you, leave with that quiet vertigo that comes when the ground they trusted suddenly expands into sky. So no, they didn't fail. They witnessed something outside the syllabus. They stared directly into the next stage of human awareness and mistook it for anomaly. You didn't come here to be understood. You came here to remind them what understanding feels like before it's named, before it's reduced to ink and theory. You are the unrecorded data point, the evidence of evolution happening in real time. And somewhere, that evaluator still thinks about you, still replays the moment their certainty cracked, still wonders whether they met a person or a preview of what's coming. Because deep down, they know. You weren't a case. You were the calibration. You watched the subtle, undeniable shift happen right across the table. It started with a flicker, a momentary pause in their professional veneer, and then came the profound, gut-wrenching change in their face, the sight of something crucial giving way, something foundational snapping behind their eyes. You were a witness to the precise, terrible moment of realization. They were not merely conducting an evaluation. They were sitting across from someone whose reality operated on a completely different scale. You represented conclusions they were still years from approaching, solutions to problems they were currently grappling with, and a completed journey that they hadn't even registered on their personal map. The air thickened with this unspoken truth, leading to an ending that felt less like closure and more like an emergency exit. The session dissolved into an awkward, hollow exchange. Their thank you was purely mechanical, the standard reassurances entirely absent. Their words spoke of following up, but their body language screamed a clear, urgent directive. I need you to leave. They needed solitude, a private space in which they could safely fall apart and reassemble the fragments of their shattered professional self. The aftershock. You gathered your things and departed with your customary calm and grace. This uncomfortable denouement was not a novelty. It was, in fact, a predictable outcome when you simply refused to perform. It wasn't the first time your authentic existence, unedited and unminimized, had functioned as a catalyst, revealing the profound inadequacy of someone else's entire life framework. There is no malice in this process, no deliberate intent to wound or expose. It is simply the consequence of your refusal to shrink, your refusal to pretend, and your steadfast refusal to translate the complexity of your experience into a smaller, more digestible dialect just to preserve another's comfort. You are an immutable fact. You speak your truth as it is. If that truth shatters an observer's professional identity, triggers an existential crisis, or forces them to confront the limitations of their understanding, that is not a burden for you to shoulder. That moment of rupture is, instead, their invitation to evolve or retreat, and the choice remains entirely theirs. The contagion of consciousness. The breakdown of their professional reality wasn't neatly contained within the evaluation room. It spread outward like a silent, measurable form of radiation. The evaluator went home, utterly unable to sleep, lying in the darkness and replaying the tape of the conversation in a desperate attempt to pinpoint the exact moment when the dynamic inverted, when they lost command of an interaction they were trained, credentialed, and paid to manage. At 3 a.m., driven by a gnawing compulsion, they rose, brewed a cup of coffee that remained untouched, and opened their laptop. What followed was a frantic, chaotic attempt to capture the event in language, a cascade of nonsensical notes, fragmented observations, half-formed theories, and escalating questions, all aimed at arresting the memory before it could fade into something manageable and professionally tame. But it resisted all attempts at domestication. The experience was simply too large for language, too complex for linear documentation, too profoundly transformative to be compressed into a standard narrative form. They typed out phrases like, "Subject demonstrates awareness beyond typical developmental markers," and "Subject's presence generates observer effect that compromises clinical objectivity." They theorized that the subject appears to operate from consciousness framework outside conventional psychological models. Then, in a fit of self-censure, they stopped, deleted the entire document, started again, and deleted it once more, trapped in an exhausting loop of trying to articulate something for which their existing vocabulary was catastrophically unprepared. Across the room, their partner sensed the profound internal turbulence, inquired about work, and asked if they were okay, but received answers that offered no genuine comfort or satisfying explanation for the chasm that had opened between them and the world. Across the room, their partner sensed the profound internal turbulence, inquired about work, and asked if they were okay, but received answers that offered no genuine comfort or satisfying explanation for the chasm that had opened between them and the world. The silence they projected, the subtle withdrawal of their presence, spoke volumes that no professional code could decode. The trauma of the encounter was not about you, the subject, but about the irreversible damage to their internal architecture. They realized their entire career had been spent mapping a territory that was only a small island in a vast, unnamed ocean, and you were the tide that proved the map obsolete. Every textbook definition, every case study, every hard-won piece of expertise now felt like an elaborate fiction designed to shield them from the staggering complexity of reality. They continued to stare at the ceiling, not just replaying the conversation, but re-evaluating their entire past, present, and future through the terrifying clarity you had gifted them. The coffee grew cold. The notes remained a tangle of contradictions, and the certainty of their life bled away into the 3 a.m. existential dread. The tension became a tangible thing in their home, a constant low-frequency hum that made simple cohabitation difficult. When their partner reached out, a kind, normal gesture, the evaluator recoiled, not in anger, but because they felt physically unstable, as if a normal touch might destabilize the precarious mental scaffolding they were struggling to rebuild. They started seeking solitude in ways that were alien to their nature. Long, directionless drives in the pre-dawn hours, sitting in their office after everyone left, simply staring out the window, trying to reconcile the meticulously organized world they had lived in with the fluid, boundaryless existence you embodied. They were haunted by the feeling that they had missed something crucial, not just in the session, but in their own life's work. They began to suspect that the very tools of their trade, the questionnaires, the models, the diagnostic criteria, were not instruments of understanding, but rather a sophisticated system of willful blindness. They had been trained to categorize anomalies, but you weren't an anomaly. You were an evolutionary leap, and trying to fit you into a label felt like trying to bottle the ocean. Their daily work became an exercise in profound irony. Listening to patients describe their struggles, the evaluator could now hear the static, the noise, the limitations of the conventional framework, a limitation they themselves had been forced to confront. They knew, with cold certainty, that they could no longer offer the standard reassurances because they no longer believed in the framework that supported them. They began to question the ethics of their entire profession, wondering if the greatest disservice they could do was to offer comfort within a cage of flawed understanding. The memory of your calm, unflinching gaze was the constant point of pressure, forcing them to consider. What if the problem wasn't the subject, but the scale of the observation? This wasn't burnout. It was a fundamental shift in perception, a forced awakening that rendered their previous life not wrong, but small. They would spend the coming months navigating this desolate professional space, unable to go back to the comforting delusion of certainty and terrified of stepping fully into the unknown clarity you had shown them. And so began their unraveling, not a loud collapse, not the kind that ends in public disgrace or professional scandal, but the quiet disintegration of certainty that creeps through the cracks of thought until everything familiar feels foreign. Days blurred together as they went through the motions, sitting in meetings, offering nods of agreement, maintaining the appearance of competence, while inside, the architecture of their understanding continued to dissolve. Theories that once felt solid now seemed fragile, brittle under the weight of new awareness. They would catch themselves mid-sentence, realizing that the words they'd spoken 1,000 times before no longer carried any meaning. Their colleagues noticed the shift. Small things at first, a delay in responses, a strange stillness during consultations, a new hesitancy when once there had been clinical precision. They excused it as fatigue, stress, overwork. But they knew the truth. Something fundamental had been rewritten inside them, and there was no returning to the old script. Each night they replayed your conversation like a haunting melody, not to dissect it, but to feel its rhythm, to trace the shape of the silence that had changed them. You hadn't argued or preached. You had simply been, anchored, effortless, entirely unmasked. That presence became a kind of gravitational field that continued to tug at their mind even in sleep. They began dreaming differently, lucid, symbolic dreams, where rooms folded into themselves, where faces blurred, where questions answered themselves in soundless clarity. They would wake at odd hours, drenched in a mix of awe and dread, feeling as though they'd glimpsed something enormous and benevolent, yet terrifyingly indifferent. You had introduced them to a reality too vast to categorize, and now they were drifting somewhere between the person they had been and the one they were becoming. Over time, this internal war took shape as obsession disguised as curiosity. They started reading outside their field, reaching into mysticism, quantum theory, consciousness studies, philosophy, anything that could offer a framework for what they'd seen. Their notes evolved from professional analysis to fevered exploration. Perception as living intelligence. Observation alters structure. Subject exists in a self-reflexive feedback loop of awareness. These were no longer case notes. They were prayers written in the syntax of science. Their handwriting became frantic, almost desperate, as if the act of writing could bridge the gap between comprehension and surrender. The walls of their office filled with pinned pages, diagrams, and phrases connected by red string, an attempt to map the unmappable. Colleagues began to whisper. There were questions about their judgment, concerns about their stability. But the evaluator didn't care. They had crossed the threshold where reputation mattered less than truth. In their solitude, they began to sense what you had tried to show them. That awareness is not a phenomenon to be studied, but a living field that studies itself through everything it touches. They saw how their years of training had turned curiosity into control, how the sterile pursuit of objectivity had amputated the wonder from inquiry. For the first time, they understood that the act of observing changes both the observer and the observed, not metaphorically, but literally. They felt it now, like an irreversible mutation in their own perception. And then came the moment of surrender. It didn't happen in a flash of revelation or breakdown, but in the stillness of an early morning when the first light seeped through their window. They sat there, surrounded by chaos, papers, books, empty coffee cups, and realized that all their efforts to understand you were just extensions of the same error. The need to define what was never meant to be confined. You had not come to be studied. You had come to awaken something dormant. You were the question that refused to shrink, the reminder that understanding is not about mastery, but communion. In that moment, they stopped trying to write about you. They closed the laptop, sat back, and for the first time in years, simply breathed without analysis. Something in them softened. They began to notice the world again, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the rhythm of their partner's breathing, the way light refracts through glass. Ordinary things became extraordinary. They realized that consciousness wasn't a subject of study, but the medium of existence itself. You had shown them that awareness is not something to be reached, but something to be remembered. That truth doesn't live in conclusions. It lives in presence. From that day forward, their work was never the same. They spoke less, listened more, and when they did speak, their words carried a strange, new gentleness. Patients began to feel it too, the sense that they were no longer being analyzed, but witnessed. Somewhere deep inside, they still wondered if they would ever see you again. But perhaps they didn't need to. A prayer, then, one that doesn't beg or plead, but remembers. May the silence between thoughts become a sanctuary, not an emptiness. May every unanswered question open into deeper knowing rather than fear. May we stop mistaking analysis for awareness and control for peace. Let every false certainty that once defined us crumble quietly, so the truth can finally breathe through what remains. May we no longer seek safety in explanation, but in alignment with what is real, raw, and unmeasured. Grant us the courage to face what cannot be categorized, the humility to see that every living thing carries intelligence far beyond our models, and the grace to meet mystery not as a threat, but as kin. Let our logic soften enough to let the sacred in through its fractures. Let our words serve truth, not conceal it. Let every act, no matter how small, become a form of devotion to the awakening that is already unfolding within us. For those who have looked into the abyss and found it staring back with kindness, for those who can no longer fit into the narrow cages of ordinary thinking, this prayer is for you. You are not broken. You are expanding. You are not too much. You are simply what happens when evolution forgets to wait for permission. May your path stay luminous in the dark. May your stillness shake worlds. May your existence remain the quiet calibration of what's next. And until we meet again, rise gently, shine fiercely. Greetings from the channel, Rise and Shine.